All right, let's jump right into this explainer. You know, when we picture George Washington, we usually just imagine that stoic face on the $1 bill, or maybe those marble statues you see scattered all over the country. But today, we're going to unpack the actual lived reality of a man whose legacy is this fascinating study in power, precedent, and honestly, a profound paradox. We're going to look directly at the source material of his life to see how his choices shaped an entire nation.
To kick things off, and this might actually surprise you, as commander-in-chief, Washington literally lost more battles than he won. Seriously, he wasn't some kind of invincible tactical genius on the battlefield who just steamrolled the opposition.
And yet, despite that pretty striking military track record, the guy became an absolute international hero. So, how does that happen? How does a general with a losing record turn into the revered father of a nation? Well, it wasn't really about how he fought. It was about how he handled power, and even more importantly, how he chose to walk away from it.
Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We're going to cover his ambition and early failures, his leadership during the Revolution, the shaping of the first presidency, the realities of slavery in his world, and finally, his legacy of relinquishing power.
So let's start with Section 1, Ambition and Early Failures.
Washington's story actually kicks off on February 22, 1732. He spent most of his childhood at Ferry Farm in Virginia. But his life took a massive, drastic pivot really early on. When he was just 11 years old, his father passed away. And this meant two monumental things for young George. First off, he became a slave owner at just 11, since the plantations he lived on were completely maintained by enslaved labor. Second, unlike his older half-brothers, he missed out on a formal education. Instead of heading off to prestigious schools, he stayed back to help his mom on the farm, hitting the books on his own and relying entirely on self-guided study for the rest of his life.
But what's really fascinating is how he took the reins of his own trajectory. By age 17, tapping into some family connections, he managed to get appointed as the official surveyor for Culpeper County. Now, this was a real game changer. It wasn't just a job. It meant adventure, a steady paycheck, and a first-hand look at unclaimed frontier land. More than anything, surveying planted a lifelong conviction in his head about the absolute necessity of westward expansion for the future of the colonies.
All that ambition really boiled over in his 20s, which, let's be honest, were completely chaotic. In 1753, at just 21 years old, he's sent as a major to deliver a demand telling the French to abandon the Ohio Valley. He actually published an account of this trip, which completely put him on the international map. But then just a year later, in 1754, a mission out west ended in this humiliating surrender at Fort Necessity, and he ended up resigning his commission. Fast forward to 1755, he's serving as an aide-de-camp and witnesses the absolute disaster of the British defeat under General Braddock. But in the middle of all that chaos, Washington actually got commended for rallying the survivors. He was definitely learning leadership the hard way.
After this really intense military stint, his life takes a sharp turn. In 1758, he marries Martha Dandridge Custis, a very wealthy widow. This union brought him major wealth and a lifelong partner. So between 1759 and 1775, he settles into this life of a gentleman farmer. He serves multiple terms in the Virginia House of Burgesses and massively expands his plantation operations, an expansion, we have to note, that relied entirely on the forced labor of a growing enslaved community.
Moving right along to Section 2, Leading the Revolution.
By the 1770s, Washington is all in on supporting colonial protests against British taxes. And in June 1775, Congress taps him to be Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. For the next 8 grueling years, he stays right there with the Army. And like we talked about earlier, yeah, he lost more battles than he won. But just think about what they were up against. The Continental Army was constantly scraping by for the absolute basics. We're talking food, supplies, ammunition. Through all of that, the Army persisted. Honestly, it was Washington's sheer willpower that kept the fight for independence from just burning out entirely.
But beyond the battlefield, we see what is arguably his greatest wartime achievement. Washington made absolutely sure that military power always stayed subordinate to the civilian government. He never once used his massive authority to challenge Congress, and he aggressively shut down any potential military coups from within his own ranks. He held a deep conviction that the military answers to the people's representatives. And this whole philosophy reached its peak when the Treaty of Paris finally ended the war. Instead of pulling a classic victorious general move and declaring himself a military dictator, Washington did the unthinkable. He just resigned his commission to Congress.
Willingly giving up power like that was virtually unheard of in modern history. That single act is exactly what permanently locked in his status as a global hero.
Which brings us to Section 3, Shaping the First Presidency.
Now, Washington really thought he was completely done with public life. But the young nation was floundering under the Articles of Confederation, with these huge economic, diplomatic, and domestic crises. So, in 1787, they call him back as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention to help build a centralized government. When the delegates designed this powerful new executive branch, they really only had one guy in mind for the job. The trust they had in him was just off the charts. To this day, George Washington is the only president to be unanimously elected. By April 1789, he's leaving Mount Vernon and heading to New York City for his inauguration.
Because he was the very first president, literally everything he did was a first. He established these massive structural precedents that still define the office today. He created the president's cabinet. He asserted executive privilege. He dropped the very first presidential veto. And he expanded the executive's reach over foreign and domestic affairs, like brilliantly navigating the neutrality crisis in 1793 and then subduing the Whiskey Rebellion the following year. The guy was essentially building the airplane while flying it.
Let's transition to Section 4, Slavery in Washington's World.
To really understand the source material of Washington's life, we have to take a hard, objective look at the harsh reality that underpinned his entire existence, from his childhood right up to the highest office in the land. During his presidency, there were at least 10 enslaved individuals forced to work at the president's houses in New York City and Philadelphia. Their names were Ona, Hercules, Maul, Giles, Austin, Richmond, Paris, Joe, Christopher Shields, and William Lee. They were forced to do everything, tending the horses and carriages, cooking, laundry, cleaning the home, caring for the grandchildren, even helping the Washingtons dress. And greeting guests. It's incredibly important to connect this abstract idea of his presidential households to the daily, lived reality of these 10 specific individuals who maintained his wealth and his standard of living.
Finally, Section 5, Relinquishing Power and Legacy.
As his second term wrapped up, Washington found himself facing another massive choice about power. And here is the real kicker. In 1797, he voluntarily retired after 2 terms. He honestly could have likely stayed president for life, but he walked away. By 1801, Thomas Jefferson followed that exact precedent, and so did every single successive president right up until FDR. Ultimately, in 1951, the 22nd Amendment officially capped it at 2 terms. Washington's choice to exit voluntarily? It literally hardwired the peaceful transfer of power into the DNA of the American system.
So Washington heads back to Mount Vernon, hoping for a quiet retirement. But it was pretty brief. On December 14, 1799, he died from a severe throat infection, bringing an end to a life completely dominated by public service.
But, his final act was actually written into his will. Just to put this in perspective, Washington was a slave owner for 56 years of his life, starting from the time he was just an 11-year-old boy. Yet that very will included a provision to immediately free William Lee, his enslaved valet who had been by his side through the entire American Revolution. On top of that, he legally stipulated that the other 122 enslaved people he owned were to receive their freedom upon Martha's passing. He stands as the only founding father president to free all the people he held in bondage.
Which really brings us to a question that sits right at the heart of the American founding. How exactly do we weigh the legacy of a leader who fought to secure a nation's freedom, set the ultimate precedents for a democratic republic, but denied that exact same freedom to others for 56 years? It is a profound, complex paradox. We're looking at a man who repeatedly gave up immense, world-altering power for the greater good, while simultaneously holding absolute power over the lives of hundreds of individuals. I'm going to leave you to ponder that legacy. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history around you.